places of interest, of course, are all in the UK. So we're just going to start straight from the first one. Ackworth School, Yorkshire. The main block of the school is a fine Georgian building erected in 1750 as one of Captain Thomas Gorham's Foundling Hospitals. In 1779 it was acquired by the Society of Friends for the guarded education of the children of Friends, not in affluence, so poor kids, and is now a boarding school run by the Quakers. So Ackworth is 3.5 miles south of Pontefract on the A628 if you want to go and check it out. Arbury Hall, Warwickshire. Arbury is essentially an Elizabethan house which was transformed into a Gothic one in the second half of the 18th century. This transformation was undertaken by Sir Roger Newdigate at very much the same time as Horace Walpole was building his famous House of Strawberry Hill at Twickenham. Indeed, with the destruction of Strawberry Hill, Arbury is one of the most complete and best preserved Gothic revival houses in England. Work began in 1750 with help from a gentleman architect, Sanderson Miller, but he was superseded in 1762 by Henry Keane. Keane's principal contribution to Arbury was the high-vaulted dining room. 14 years later, Henry Couchman of Warwick took over and Gothicised the courtyard, and then the east, west and north fronts, and redecorated the rooms which they contained. The most important of these rooms is the saloon, where Couchman was clearly inspired in his design of the vault by Henry VII's chapel at Westminster Abbey. And Arbury Hall is 2 miles southwest of Nuneaton off the B4102, and the nearest station is Nuneaton, 3 miles away. Berrington Hall, Herefordshire. The present house was built by Thomas Harley, a banker and government contractor who became Lord Mayor of London and distinguished himself by helping to suppress the Wilkite riots. In the 1770s, he began to lay out the grounds and to build the house at Berrington. The gardens were laid out by Capability Brown, who also probably advised the siting of the house, for the architect was Henry Holland the Younger, Brown's son-in-law. He planned the house in an original way, with a 3-storied rectangular central block and 3 subsidiary office pavilions, forming a courtyard at the rear. The interior of the house is very lavish, with fine plaster ceilings ornamented by painted roundels. These were probably the work of Biagio Rebecca, who was one of Robert Adams' craftsmen, and had worked at Osterley and Sion. So Berrington is 3 miles north of Leominster, a quarter-mile west of the A49, and the nearest station is Leominster. And then we have Clermont in Surrey, and this is an aerial view of Clermont showing the garden front. Clermont originally belonged to Thomas Pelham, Duke of Newcastle, but after his death in 1768 it was purchased by Lord Clive on his retirement from India. Clive commissioned Capability Brown to pull down the house which had been designed by Vanbrugh, and to build a arches surmounted by pilasters on the garden front. The interior decoration was begun in 1772, and Henry Holland was made chiefly responsible for this. One of his apprentices was John Sloane, who later claimed to have designed the entrance hall. Clermont eventually became the marriage home of Princess Charlotte, daughter of the Prince Regent, and her husband, Prince Leopold. Clermont is half a mile southeast from Esher on the Esher-Oxshott Road, the 8244. Claydon House, Buckinghamshire. Now this is the Chinese room at Claydon, showing the pagoda-like alcove which dominates the room. The present house at Claydon was built by Ralph and Earl Verney in 1768. The work was begun by Sir Thomas Robinson, a gentleman architect from Yorkshire, who admired Berrington's Palladianism but hated anything savouring of Rococo. He was responsible for the parts of the west front that are now destroyed. The surviving wing was built by Luke Lightfoot in the 1760s, and he was responsible for the incredible suite of Rococo rooms. The carving in these is very rich indeed, mostly of wood rather than plaster. Much of the design is derived from the plates made for Chippendale's director. The great staircase is very fine, with parquetry, patterns of holly, ebony and ivory on the treads, and delicately wrought iron balustrades. The decoration of the suite of rooms upstairs is even more exuberant. These may well have been decorated after Lightfoot's dismissal by his craftsman, Marston. Among them is the Gothic room, so named because of its Strawberry Hill form of decoration and mock medieval details. Another is the Chinese room, marking the acme of Chinese tastes made popular in the 1750s. The wall facing the windows is dominated by an extravagant pagoda-like alcove, where Rococo detail mingles with chinoiserie design. Now Claydon is near the village of Middle Claydon, west of East Claydon, 3.5 miles southwest of Winslow. The Georgian Theatre, Richmond, Yorkshire. During the 18th century, drama was limited both in London and the provinces to houses holding royal patents, and these were few. In 1788, however, a wide freedom of performance was granted, and the actor-manager Samuel Butler built and opened a theatre in Richmond to accommodate the town and country in a more commodious manner. The theatre was in regular use until 1830, and the company at one stage included a teenager called Gary, who went on to achieve fame in London as Edmund Kean. During the 19th century, the theatre fell into disuse and was converted into a warehouse, but in 1960 a trust was formed to restore it to its former glory. The original paybox, pit, boxes, gallery and forestage have all survived. Traces of the original green paint have been found. Green was the traditional colour for the general interiors of 18th century theatres in England, and the original scheme of decoration has been restored. Audiences can now watch performances existing mansion is mostly the work of Charles, 3rd Duke of Richmond, who succeeded to his title in 1750. George III sent him to Versailles as ambassador extraordinary to the court of Louis XV in 1765. While he was in France, he obtained many of the treasures still contained in the house, including the fine collection of Sèvres porcelain and the Louis XV furniture. In 1760 he commissioned Sir William Chambers to rebuild the house, of which the present long hall formed the entrance hall and linked the two legs of the H. At the end of the century, James Wyatt was employed to build a grandiose octagon with a tower at each corner. Only 3 sides of the octagon were completed, one of which was a leg of Chambers H with towers added, but the scheme was so enormous and expensive that the Duke was heavily in debt at his death in 1805. So Goodwood is 3.5 miles northeast of Chichester. On the approach roads A285 and the A286, and the nearest station is Chichester. Everingham Hall, Suffolk. So this picture is one end of the saloon at Everingham Hall. The painted decoration on the walls and ceiling were executed for Wyatt by Biagio Rebecca. Everingham Hall was commissioned in 1777 by Sir Gerard Van Neck, a wealthy city financier, from Sir Robert Taylor. Taylor retained the shell of the existing Queen Anne house, but screened to the north front by a series of giant Corinthian columns, and the south front in a plain, formal style. Wings were added on either side, creating a long, narrow house in Palladian style. By 1870, Taylor had completed the exterior, but was superseded for the design of the interior by James Wyatt, a much younger architect who had achieved rapid fame and success. He produced a magnificent set of rooms in neoclassical style. Perhaps the finest is the entrance hall. Which rises through 2 stories and has a semicircular vaulted ceiling. Other outstanding rooms include the dining room, library, saloon, and the Etruscan room, which all contain their original Wyatt furniture. The park and gardens were laid out in 1781 by Capability Brown. Everingham is 4.5 miles southwest of Halesworth, 4 miles northwest of Yoxford, and the entrance lodge is on the Beesonhall Walpole Road. Hogarth's House, Chiswick. In 1749, William Hogarth moved into his house at Chiswick. At that time, his townhouse was in Leicester Square, but he needed was succeeded by James Payne, who erected the north front of the central block, while Robert Adam, newly returned from his tour of Italy, was called in to supervise the decoration of the interior. Soon Adam was in sole charge and completed the house. He built the south front of the central block, creating a facade of movement and curves in strong contrast to the more formal Palladian north front of Payne. The interior decoration was entirely the work of Adam and his team of craftsmen. They produced a series of fine state rooms grouped around the marble hall. So, on this side we have the marble hall. This is the fireplace. In the marble hall at Kedleston, every part of the design of the fireplace was supervised by Robert Adam, including the grate, fenders and fire irons. And you can find Kedleston 4.5 miles northwest of Derby. Kenwood, the Ivy Bequest. The present house at Kenwood was built for William Murray, 1st Earl of Mansfield, who became Attorney General in 1754, and 2 years later Lord Chief Justice. In 1764, Mansfield commissioned Robert Adam to remodel the house, which at that time was a 2-storied brick building with an orangery on the west side. Adam added a story to the main block and balanced the orangery by building a library to the east side. The whole structure was then encased in stucco. Perhaps Adam's finest room at Kenwood is the library, where, as the dining room at Sion, he produced a long room with apses at the ends, separated from the main body by columns. The apsidal recesses were intended as a library, while the central part of the room was to be used as a reception room. Kenwood now houses the Ivy collection of paintings bequeathed in 1927. The collection includes many fine examples of the work of Gainsborough, Raeburn and Reynolds. Now Kenwood is in Hampstead Lane, North West 3, nearest underground station Archway. Kew Palace. Here it is. This is the White House at Kew. It was remodelled by William Kent for Frederick Lewis, Prince of Wales, in 1730. George III was brought there as a child and took the house over on his mother's death in 1771. It was demolished in 1802 to make way for George's castellated palace. The Dutch House at Kew is the last survivor of a whole group of royal residences at Kew, all closely connected with George III and Queen Charlotte. The first of these was Richmond Lodge. Originally Much of his work survives, including the lake, the river layout, and the rhododendron dell. When Augusta died, the King and Queen moved into the White House. They still had accommodation problems, and the eldest two princes were moved to the Dutch House. In 1802, the White House was demolished in anticipation of the completion of the castellated palace. George III had been gradually attracted to the Gothic style of architecture, and at the turn of the century he embarked upon an ambitious scheme for a castellated palace in medieval style. This extraordinary structure was built for him on the bank of the Thames by James Wyatt. The walls were raised to their full height, but the blindness of the king prevented its completion, and it was eventually demolished in 1827. While the castellated palace was being built, the king used the Dutch House as his residence. It is an early 17th century brick-built house originally constructed by a prosperous merchant of Dutch parentage. The interior of the house was altered in 1802 for the king's residence, and thus little of the 17th century decoration is preserved. The house now contains portraits and mementos of the king and queen and their children. In the southwest corner of the garden stands Queen Charlotte's cottage, built in 1772 as a summer house and picnic retreat of the royal family. It is a two-storied building of brick with timber framing and a thatched roof, rather like the thatched palace of the Prince Regent at Windsor. The room upstairs has wall decorations painted by George's daughter, Princess Elizabeth. Now Kew is on the south bank of the Thames, 1 mile from Richmond. London, Buckingham House. Now here is a picture of Buckingham House, St James's Park in the mid-18th century. Buckingham House is essentially a late 17th century building, erected by Arlington of Cabal fame. In 1703 it was bought by John Sheffield, Duke of Buckingham, who gave the house its present name. 60 years later it was sold to George III by Charles Herbert, Buckingham's illegitimate son. The king required it as a dower house for his queen to replace old Somerset House in the event of his own early death. As the royal family grew larger, so St James's Palace became regarded as too cramped and draughty for young children, so the king moved to Buckingham House. The house was generally referred to as the Queen's House or the New Palace until George IV remodelled it with the help of Nash. In 1818 it became the official London residence of the king, and of course it's the residence of the current queen. Buckingham House, now the palace, stands at the end of the Mall. London, Thomas Coram Foundation, Brunswick Square. The charity was founded in 1739 by Captain Thomas Coram, mariner, philanthropist and pioneer in child welfare, with the aim of helping unwanted children. Up to 1945 it was known as the Foundling Hospital. The foundation has always enjoyed the support of painters, in particular William Hogarth, whose full-length portrait of Coram hangs on the first landing. Other artists who followed his example were Alan Ramsay, Thomas Gainsborough and Sir Joshua Reynolds. Handel wrote his Messiah in 1741, and during his lifetime all performances of the work were for charity, often for the Foundling Hospital. These include the philosophical table, the compound engine and the exhausting and compressing pump. The Science Museum is on Exhibition Road, SW7. Nearest underground station is South Kensington. London, Somerset House and the Royal Academy. In 1760, Protector Somerset's Tudor mansion on the Strand was made over to Queen Charlotte as part of her marriage settlement. It was little used, however, and Charles Churchill described it in 1763 as a palace turned into a den, to barracks turned and soldiers tread, where dowagers have laid their head. The Royal Academy of Arts was founded in 1768 with Sir Joshua Reynolds as president and William Chambers as treasurer. The rapid growth in scope and scale of its activities made it necessary to find sufficiently large and imposing accommodation. Therefore, in 1771, George III gave Chambers the use of several apartments in Old Somerset House, and 4 years later gave up the whole palace to public use in exchange for the formal title of residence to Buckingham House. Chambers produced a plan to develop the Somerset House and Savoy sites to accommodate the Royal Academy and other learned bodies. Both King and Parliament accepted this plan, and the foundation stone of new Somerset House was laid in 1776. 4 years later, the King attended the preview of the first Royal Academy exhibition. The Royal Academy moved to Berrington House in 1837. The Royal Society and the Society of Antiquaries were accommodated in Somerset House until 1856 and 1874 respectively. It is planned to free certain sections of Somerset House from civil service occupancy, and possibly these will be restored to something like their original use. Somerset House stands on the Strand. It is now used for the Probate Registry and Board of Inland Revenue. Okay, so I am going to leave it there. Hope you enjoyed that little reading. I thought it was really interesting. This has been Kate at the Library of Whispers. I shall see you very, very soon.